What's up, everybody? Mr. Forrest back with another episode of Big Truths. Guys, it's been a couple weeks because in Calvary Kids Wednesday a few weeks ago we had a play night. That means the kids come and we just play all night. We just fellowship together by playing. And then last week we were snowed out, and so we didn't have a Calvary Kids Wednesday at all. I did upload the laser tag preaching video, so if you want to see the preaching for that, check it out in my channel. Just go to my channel, scroll down and find it. I'll also put a link in the description below. But now we're back in it. We're back in our Big Truths series, and I'm super excited. And I'm so glad to be here with you guys again. Guys, we're going to talk about something that's kind of difficult to understand, but it's all in the mind of God. Let's get right to it. So tonight, our story starts in Genesis 37 with a 17-year-old teenager named Joseph. His dad's name was Jacob or Israel, and he had 11 brothers. Now, the story kind of begins when he goes out to check on his brothers who are supposed to be feeding the flock, but instead they're doing bad stuff, and he tells on them. This makes the brothers angry, and they begin to hate him. To make matters worse, Joseph is the well-behaved one. He's the dad's favorite, and it's obvious that he's the dad's favorite. To make matters worse, to show that he's the dad's favorite, Jacob gives him a special tunic. Now, we have heard our whole lives that it was a coat of many colors, but we don't know that for sure. We're not quite sure what the Hebrew word means. It was some kind of tunic and some kind of clothing. And art in Egypt, ancient art in Egypt from around this time, show Canaanite men wearing like long-sleeved embroidered tunics with a sash that goes diagonal from waist to knee. And maybe it was something like that. It might have had many colors. We're just not sure. But how do you think that the brothers felt when Joseph got one, but they didn't? Left out? Jealous? More angry? More filled with hatred? To make matters even worse, Joseph started having dreams. He had a dream that they were bundling grain, and all of their sheaves, all of their bundles of grain bowed down to his bundle. And the brothers knew what that meant. It meant that Joseph thought that his brothers were going to bow down to him, and this made them even more angry. Now, maybe you've had weird dreams before, like you wake up and you're like, what just happened? Like maybe you dreamed you were made out of nacho cheese and your neighbor was a giant rat who chased you all the way to France and up the Eiffel Tower, and you certainly thought you were a goner until David Hasselhoff came by on his helicopter to rescue you and take you to the planet Nacho, where you would blend perfectly with mango salsa and satisfy the cosmic Dorito eater. Clearly it's just me. And then he had another dream that the sun, the moon, and the stars all bowed down to Joseph, and his brothers knew what that meant, that his dad, mom, and all his brothers would bow down to him, and this made them even more jealous and even more angry, even more filled with hatred. And things came to a head one day when Joseph was going down to check on his brothers again. Maybe they were supposed to be feeding the flocks again, and maybe they were doing bad stuff again, so when he came, they said, oh look, it's the dreamer. They hated their brother so badly that they wanted to kill him. Now, how messed up do you have to be, and how filled with hatred do you have to be to want to kill your own brother? Reuben stepped in, and Reuben didn't want him to die, and he was looking for a way to rescue Joseph, and he was like, let's not kill him, let's throw him in that hole. Now, it was probably a cistern. A cistern was cut out of limestone or sometimes dug in the ground and coated with like a plaster-like substance to catch rainwater. But this cistern was empty, and so they took Joseph and they threw him in this hole. And I would imagine in my mind that Joseph was hollering for help and begging his brothers not to do this. He might have even been hurt being thrown down in there. But his brothers had no compassion at all. They just sat down and ate their lunch like nothing had happened. How messed up do you have to be to do that? And they're sitting there and they're eating and they're talking about what to do with Joseph. And somebody has the idea that they should sell him as a slave. So trade caravans coming by with traders who were trading, selling spices and garments and other things. And they sold their own brother for 20 shekels. Now that was about 2 years' wages. So like today, maybe in the area that I live in, that would be like $100,000. And they kept the money. How much do you think Joseph's heart broke when his own brother sold him as a slave? They kept the money for themselves, and they took his tunic and they went back to their dad. They tore the tunic, killed a goat from their flocks, and put his blood on the tunic. And they brought the tunic to their dad, and they said, "Dad, does this belong to your son?" And Jacob broke down crying, weeping, sobbing, wailing. His beloved son was dead, and the brothers went, "Oh, a beast must have torn him to shreds, and now he's dead." They watched their own dad, broken-hearted, mourning for his son, and they didn't even tell him the truth. Joseph was taken to Egypt by this trade caravan, and he was sold to an Egyptian named Potiphar. Now, Potiphar was the captain of the royal guards. He worked for Pharaoh himself. Pharaoh was the king of Egypt. And while working for Potiphar, Joseph didn't stop loving God. He still loved God. He still wanted to be wise. So he worked hard, and Potiphar noticed, and Potiphar promoted him to his assistant. And while he was working for Potiphar, God blessed Joseph, and Potiphar's crops grew well, and his animals were healthy. And Potiphar became more and more rich, and Potiphar noticed, and he promoted Joseph again to being over Potiphar's entire household. With Joseph managing the household, Potiphar didn't have to do anything. You see, Joseph was very wise, but Joseph was also very handsome. And Potiphar's wife took notice. And she wanted a smooch from Joseph. And Joseph was like, "Get off me. I'm not your husband. Go kiss on your own husband." But daily she would try to find Joseph, and she'd try to get Joseph to kiss her, and Joseph's like, "Get off me, I don't want any of that." And he started avoiding her. He started hiding from her, like making sure she wasn't around when he did his work. But one day they were in the house and they were all alone. And Potiphar's wife grabbed Joseph by the robe and said, "Kiss me, big boy." And Joseph said, "Get off me, get off me, get off me, get off me." He wiggled out of his robe and he ran away. Now, I kind of understand this. When I was your age, we used to play this game. It was like tag, but we wouldn't just tag the person. We would grab the person, and they'd have to, if you caught them, they'd have to walk with you back to jail. And the jail would like fill up with more and more people until somebody who hadn't been caught yet like ran in, and just everybody had to be touching something like a piece of the playground equipment. And if someone who hadn't been caught ran in and touched what everyone else was touching, then everybody was free. It was like Prison Break or something like that. I can't remember what we called it, but I was it one time, and I grabbed this guy by the jacket, and I was taking him to jail, and he very quickly unzipped his jacket, wiggled out, and ran away, and I was left holding his jacket, and it was like, and that's like what Joseph did, because Potiphar's wife grabbed him by the robe, and she's like, "Kiss me, big boy," and he was like, "Get off me, get off me, get off me," and he wiggles out, and she's left with the robe like, and Joseph runs away. Well, she screams, and when she screams, all the servants come running. "What's wrong, what's wrong, what's wrong?" She says, "Joseph tried to smooch me, and I screamed, and when I screamed, he tried to run away, and look, he left his robe behind." Potiphar's wife lied, and as a result, Joseph was thrown in the royal prison. Now, I think that Potiphar believed Joseph and not his wife. Here's why. There's a lot of evidence that in that time, in different parts of that area, there were laws that if a man tried to force himself on another man's wife, he would be put to death. So Potiphar could have had Joseph put to death, but he didn't. Instead, he had him thrown in the royal prison, and I think he might have done that because he knew what his wife was like. If she was doing that to Joseph every day, don't you think she would probably have done that to other men also? She was just a bad person. And so she probably lived a habit of this, and Potiphar knew about it. But he wanted to avoid political scandal, so he had Joseph thrown in the royal prison. Joseph was in this prison for 2 years. And probably for 2 years, he missed his dad. And for 2 years, he probably thought about his brothers who sold him as a slave, and thought about how Potiphar's wife lied, and thought about how Potiphar believed him, but still threw him in prison anyway. And probably wondered, has God abandoned me? Has God forsaken me? Why am I here? Now, while Joseph was in prison, Pharaoh sent 2 other guys to the royal prison. He sent his head butler, and he sent his wine taster. Now, Pharaoh was super rich, and he lived in a big palace, and he had a whole lot of servants. He had musicians, he had dancers, he had storytellers and rustlers and magicians and actors and singers. He had all kinds of people, and he had a whole staff of bakers. And this guy who was thrown in the prison was the head baker. He was over all the other bakers. But there's also the wine taster who had a job that I would never want. So he would taste Pharaoh's wine before Pharaoh would drink it. Any cup of wine that Pharaoh drank, the wine taster would have to drink it first to see if the wine tasted good. If it didn't taste good, he'd send it back and they'd send a different wine. But also he tested it to see if it was poison. And if the wine taster took a sip and the wine was poison, he'd fall down dead. Do you see why it's not a very good job? These guys came in and Joseph became their servant. And day to day, Joseph was with them, so he knew what they were like. And one day they seemed very sad. And Joseph asked them, he said, guys, what's going on? Is everything okay? Why are you sad? And the guys said, we had these really, really weird dreams, and we don't know what they mean. Now, back in that time, God spoke to some people sometimes through dreams. And they didn't know if God, or they probably didn't worship the true God, what the gods they thought were trying to communicate to them. Have you ever had weird dreams? Like you're starring in your own reality TV show, but you're really a goldfish who has legs and can breathe out of water. You have a best friend who's a unicorn named Greg, and every time Greg burps, he hurls out rainbows that smell like glitter and sadness. Clearly that's just me. These guys had dreams, and the wine taster had a dream that there were 3 branches, and the 3 branches budded and blossomed and then grew grapes. And with one hand, the wine taster squeezed the grapes, and in the other hand he held the cup, and then he gave the cup filled with juice to Pharaoh. The chief baker, the head baker, also had a dream, and in his dream there were 3 baskets filled with baked goods, and he had them stacked one on top of the other and stacked and carrying them on his head. Now to us that sounds kind of weird, or maybe to some even ridiculous. But it's not ridiculous in some cultures. Some cultures, they carry a lot of things on their heads. When I was in Ghana, West Africa, I watched people carry a basket of eggs on their head without using their hands, and they just walk down the street with a basket of eggs on their head, and I'd be afraid I'd drop that and the eggs would go all over the place. I saw people carrying animals on their head. I saw a woman walking down the street with a mattress on her head. In some cultures, it's just common to carry things on your head, and he's carrying 3 baskets full of baked goods on his head. But the birds keep flying down and pecking stuff out of those baskets full of baked goodies, and he's trying to get them away. And so they asked Joseph, they said, Joseph, we don't know what these mean. And Joseph said, well, God has helped me understand dreams, and I know what they mean. I got good news and I got bad news. And they're like, tell us the good news. And Joseph says, okay. To the wine taster, the 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh's going to come out of here, get you out of prison, and you're going to be reinstated as the wine taster. Go back to your job and everything's going to be just fine. And they were like, that is good news. What's the bad news? He said, head baker, the 3 baskets that were on your head are 3 days also. And in 3 days, Pharaoh's going to come and get you out of here. And he said, why is that bad news? And Joseph said, and then he's going to chop off your head. Have a nice day. He told the wine taster, just remember me when you get out of prison. Sure enough, 3 days later, Pharaoh threw himself a huge birthday bash. The party was massive, and he had the government officials come and all the important people and the people of his household come. And sure enough, he got the wine taster and the head butler out of prison. The wine taster was reinstated to his job, but the baker was decapitated. And unfortunately, the wine taster forgot about Joseph. So 2 years went by. 2 years. And Pharaoh had this weird dream. Maybe you have weird dreams, like you're playing for the Dallas Mavericks, and instead of a basketball, you're playing with a beach ball filled with helium, and instead of trying to shoot it through an orange hoop, you're trying to hit this giant cupcake that doesn't have icing, but instead it has pink horseradish, and every time you score, you have to do the river dance in a tutu while howling at the moon? Clearly, it's just me. Pharaoh had these weird dreams about cows eating cows. He had these weird dreams about grain eating grain. And he's like, I don't know what they mean. And the wine taster says, hey, wait a second. I know this dude that I met in prison, and his name's Joseph, and he told me what my dreams mean. Maybe he can tell you what your dreams mean. So Pharaoh calls for Joseph, and Joseph comes out. And by God's grace, because God helped Joseph understand dreams, Joseph understood Pharaoh's dream, and basically what he said is, look, there is a huge famine coming. A famine is when there's not a lot of food or water for a period of time. And in that part of the world, it meant they just didn't get the rain that they needed, etc., etc. And he said a huge famine's coming. And what you got to do, it's coming in 7 years. So for the first 7 years, before it comes, there's going to be bounty, plenty. So I want you to store up as much food as you can, so during the 7 years of famine, people from all over, nations from all surrounding Egypt will come to you and buy food from you, and the people will live and you'll get rich. Pharaoh liked that idea. And it happened just like Joseph said. For 7 years they gathered grain. And then when the famine hit, people from all the surrounding nations came and bought food from Egypt. You see, Joseph had been through so much, but God had a plan all along to save people. And so many people from all over that area of the world had to come and buy food from Egypt, including Joseph's brothers. And when they did, listen to what Joseph said to them. Genesis 45, 4 through 5. So Joseph said to his brothers, come near to me, please. And they came near. And he said, I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. Joseph said, you sold me, but God sent me. You see, they did something evil, but God had a plan all along to get Joseph to Egypt in order to save lives. Now, the natural question when this happens, for us to ask is, okay, this was God's plan all along. So when Joseph's brothers did the bad things that they did, threw him in a pit, sold him as a slave, shouldn't they be off the hook for the bad things that they did because it was God's plan all along? What about Potiphar's wife? I mean, he would have never met the wine taster unless he was in prison. And he needed to meet the wine taster in order to interpret his dream. And he needed to interpret the wine taster's dream in order to get to Pharaoh. So wasn't it part of God's plan all along for Potiphar's wife to lie? So shouldn't she be off the hook? Shouldn't she be innocent of any wrongdoing if this was God's plan all along? The answer is no. Those people did evil things, and God will hold them accountable for those evil things. Even though he brought good out of those evil things, those people still chose to do evil, and they will still face accountability, judgment for the evil things that they've done. Look what the Bible says in Genesis 50, verse 20. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. It was God who was responsible for saving so many thousands of lives because he had a plan all along to take Joseph to Egypt, to the prison, to the courts of Pharaoh, in order to save all these people's lives, and he should be praised for it. But we have to understand that when bad things happen in the world, God still is doing his plan. God is still bringing about good and saving people. But the people who are responsible for the evil things that happen, those people are still accountable to God for their evil, and they will still face his judgment for it. So guys, today we tackled a pretty tough topic. We have God planning everything and being in control all along. We call that his sovereignty. And then we have the people who are doing bad things and causing the bad things to happen, and we call that man's responsibility. And both of these things are true. God has a plan. He's completely sovereign. He's completely in charge. He's in control. He's got a plan. He's executing his plan. People are part of that plan, and those people do bad things, but those people are still accountable for the bad things that they do. I'm going to give you a couple examples, and then I want you to think about some Bible examples where this is true. An example that comes to my mind is King Nebuchadnezzar. We talked about it a few weeks ago. He came into Jerusalem and he destroyed the temple, he destroyed the city, and carried people as captives back to Babylon. You remember that? He did such bad things to those people. But God called Nebuchadnezzar my servant. You see, God was chastening the Israelites, the people who lived in Jerusalem, for their sins. He warned them. He said, listen, stop worshiping idols or you will go as captives to Babylon. And they didn't stop worshiping idols. But God used Nebuchadnezzar, who was doing terrible, evil things, to bring about his plan. Another one I can think about is Judas. Judas, we have his betrayal prophesied in the Psalms. God knew it was going to happen all along. It was part of the process for Jesus to die on the cross. But even though it was part of God's plan all along, Judas is still accountable, is still responsible. Here we are 2,000 years later, and he's still being punished for his sins. What about the people who crucified Jesus? It was God's plan all along for Jesus to die on the cross. He had to die on the cross to pay for our sins. But those people who drove the nails in his hands and feet, those people are still accountable for their evil actions. Do you see what I mean? God had a plan all along, but the people who are the ones doing the evil, they're still accountable because they still did the evil thing. So this is kind of difficult to understand, but think about it. See if you can come up with some more Bible examples of God being in control and having a plan all along, people doing evil things, but God still using that situation in spite of the evil things that they do. And let me know. Guys, it's been fun. Can't wait to see you next time. Mr. Forrest out.